Okay, so we've added some lighting. Now let's switch over to our materials. So we're using the mesh standard material. There's a few other types of materials that we could use, but the mesh standard material kind of combines the properties of a few different materials. So let's look at a few different types of materials, and then we'll work with our mesh standard material. We can also look at these in the examples for Three.js. They have a few different places where you can see all of the materials lined up together. And then blending, different types of materials. There's one more that's kind of useful. This grass material is kind of nice. Some different materials here. You can see there's a lot of detail in these. See if they have anything for standard material. Here we go, standard material. So you can see on one side, with heavy roughness, there's some more diffuse. With low roughness, they're very shiny. And then with a lot of metalness, you can see that light is reflected more here. As the bottom, with less metalness, light is reflected a bit differently. And then diffuse is how the light is spread out across. So we see kind of all these different materials and how the different properties of those materials affect the outcome. So you can have like a very shiny object, like a glass object here, versus a shiny object that's more diffuse, like ceramics or something like that. Then you kind of have over on the other side, objects that aren't shiny at all. So anyway, so our materials, we have the basic material, which is just a color. There's some options there. We have the depth material, which is how far we are from the camera. We have the normal material, which shows the normals. That's a math thing that we won't get too much into, but it's kind of a cool effect that you can use. It basically always looks like that. The Lambert material is one method for reflecting light. And you can kind of see the edges here are a little bit jagged. The Phong material is another method for reflecting light, where there's a little bit more clean edge on the shading. The Tune material, kind of hard to see here, but if we change the color, you'll see. So with the Tune material, basically it kind of just reflects light in these kind of blocky components. So that's kind of a cool stylized effect that you could use. Physical materials have a lot of different properties, but they end up kind of looking like our other materials as well. And there's a few other things that require a bit more coding, so we're going to skip those for now. With the standard material, we get kind of like the basic properties that we want to use, but it's a little bit more simplified. I'm not going to cover all of these properties. I'll just cover a few of them. So let's start with the sphere and see how these different properties affect the look of the sphere. I'm going to change the color just a little bit. So with this sphere, the defaults, the roughness is 1. That means the light is scattered a lot because the surface is very rough. So you can imagine a shiny surface is going to be more smooth. If I turn the roughness all the way down, notice that it looks a bit more shiny, and those two light sources are reflected as these kind of like bright dots. And then you can see everything in the middle. So then the metalness determines how much of the light is reflected. So if we have a high metal factor and a low roughness factor, now we're going to see really brilliant, bright spots where the light is hitting, and then very little color across the rest of the material. So if we have high roughness and high metal, it's basically like a very flat surface. If we have high roughness and low metalness, then we see a lot of light spreading across the surface. If we have low roughness, low metalness, we still have a lot of spreading of light, but we have brilliant, bright highlights. And if we have high metalness, low roughness, then we only really get those highlights. So let's get something a bit in the middle. Let's do a low roughness and a low metalness. There's also emissive, and emissive is basically like the object is sending out light and color. So if I change the emissive to white, it's just going to be bright white. If I move that down a little bit, then it's kind of a mix of the two. So this is a way for me to add a bit of color or brightness to the object, so it's kind of glowing a little bit. And so that can be a really useful effect for things like the lamp that we just created. Let's turn that back to 0 for a moment. A lot of this stuff gets a bit more complicated. I'm going to skip over some of this stuff, but then down here we have different blending modes. This is how it blends in with the rest of the scene. So let's see the scene behind here. Normal is it doesn't blend at all. We just see the object. If we do additive, then it adds together with what's behind it. And if you do subtractive, it subtracts what's behind it, and multiply. So we can kind of do these different effects. We might not really want to do them with our scene today, but they could be useful in other cases. So let's go to normal mode. There's also the opacity, which we just looked at in our scene, so we can make it a little bit transparent or see-through. And so we can combine these different properties to create different materials that look like different real-world objects. So let's go back to our scene and change a few things with their materials. So I'm going to start just with the sidewalk. We want that to be pretty rough. It's not going to be very reflective. And we could raise the metalness there a little bit. So if we go to the sidewalk, here's our street material. Here's our sidewalk material. Fortunately, we're using the same material for both parts of the sidewalk. And so if I want to change that, let's take a look at the documentation, go to mesh standard material. So I can add it as one of the parameters in the constructor. And the parameter that I want to change at the moment is the metalness. So let's say material.metalness, and let's try 0.5 and see how that affects the sidewalk. Okay, so it's a little less bright, so that looks a little bit more natural, but it's still reflecting the light in kind of a diffuse way. So that looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. So let's look at the lamps material. So for my lamp base, this is going to be metal. So let's turn the metal up and let's make it a bit shinier. So let's say for the material for my lamp base, I'll say the material.metalness is going to be 1, and material.roughness, let's say is 0.5. Okay, so now our lamps are a bit darker. They're not reflecting as much light. We can see the lamp has this little highlight from the directional light. If we wanted to increase that, I could turn the roughness way down. So if that was 0, now we would get like a really sharp highlight from that. So we can kind of see that there. But let's turn the roughness, let's do like 0.25. So now for our lamp material for the lamp itself, that's where we can have a bit of fun. We already have it a little bit transparent. Let's also make it kind of shiny so it will reflect light a bit more. So I can say lamp material dot metalness, and let's turn that up a bit, and then let's turn the lamp material dot roughness down a bit. Okay, so now you can see the highlights are a bit brighter. So now let's actually add some emissiveness to this so we can see that it has light coming out of it as well. So we can say lamp material.emissive, and that's actually going to be a color because there has to be a color for a light. So let's just do white for that. And then lamp material.emissive intensity, so the amount of emissiveness. So let's just do 0.5 for that. Oops, I forgot to say new 3-dot color here. Okay, so now we can see our lamps are glowing a little bit. So that looks pretty cool, and they're a little bit transparent. So that's kind of the effect we're going for there. So that's pretty good. I might turn the intensity of the lamp up actually a bit so it's more clear what's happening. Let's say 0.75. Okay, that looks pretty good. So now we can see our lamp. So that looks pretty good. Another thing we can do is just add these values directly into the constructor so that we're not putting them all on separate lines. So I could say like metalness 0.5, or actually let's try turning that up just a bit. We could say roughness is 0, Emissive is new 3.color 0 FF. And emissive intensity is 0.5. So when you're adding the parameters, you can use the same name, but since they're inside of an object, we use a colon and commas instead of the equal sign and the semicolon. So either way you want to do it is perfectly acceptable, but you'll get the same eventual result. But if I have a ton of parameters, like I also have transparent is true, and opacity is 0.95. So if I have that many parameters, I can put them all in this one big line instead of adding them one by one. So that looks pretty good. I might want to make my lamps a little bit cooler. So instead of using the full white, I could try something in the blue area. Okay, that looks pretty good. Actually, let's swap that. Let's use this as the actual color of the light. And we'll use the color of the light as the color of our emissive material. I think that's actually going to look a bit better. Yeah, so the lamp is kind of yellow, but the light is a bit more cool. So that looks pretty good. The lighting actually brings out the sidewalk a lot more, which is nice. So that's looking pretty good. Let's move on to our trees now. So for the trees, for the trunk, for my material, I want it to be rough. I don't want it to be quite as reflective. So let's turn the metalness up just a bit. I'll say metalness is 0.5. Okay, so it's not quite as reflective, but it's still rough, so the light is still diffuse. So that looks pretty good for the tree. So now let's work on the material for the leaves. So if we look at the leaves we have in the scene now, we can see that there's a lot more sort of like lines that we see here in between the different geometries now that we're using lighting. And so if we want to obscure that a little bit, we can actually change the color and then add some emissiveness. So it'll be more of our sort of cartoonish style. So we'll use a little bit of lighting just to give it a little bit of dimensionality, but we'll also make it a little more blocky so it's a little bit more stylized. So we can go to our leaf material. I'm going to add an emissive color here, and I'm going to use the same color as the base material color. So I'm going to say emissive, and let's say new 3.color. Just put that color in there. Then we'll give it an emissive intensity. Start at like 0.5. That's going to be very bright because we're actually adding the color of the tree on top of the other color. And it's kind of drowning out our lamp. We need to reduce that. What we can do is actually change the original color. If we make that just like black, then we get that blockiness back. So we just have that emissive color. You can see a little bit of the detail in various places, but let's bring just a tiny bit of color in here so that it's not just completely black. So let's choose something kind of green. You can maybe even choose a little bit of a slightly different green, but I want it to be very dark so that we're not adding too much to the color. So I'll choose that color and replace that there. And so now we get a little bit of the details of the trees, but it's still a bit more blocky, more stylized. Actually, I want that to be even a bit darker somewhere down here. So now we just get a little bit of the detail. It's mostly emissive. I'm going to erase the emissive intensity actually even a bit more, so we get a bit more of that green color. So that looks pretty good. And let's also raise the emissive intensity of the lamps, because now the trees seem brighter than the lamps, which doesn't make a lot of sense. So let's go back up to the lamp. I'm just going to try 1 as the emissive intensity for the lamp. And that actually looks really nice in contrast to the trees. So that looks pretty good. I'm happy with this. So this scene is looking pretty good. Let's actually change the color of the street right now. Since it's black, it's not going to interact with the lights at all. So let's go back up to our street, and instead of black, let's just make it something very dark blue. So it won't be too over the top, but we'll just get a little bit of interaction with the lights on the street. Okay, that looks much better. Very good. Great. So we've added some lighting, we've added materials. So one thing that's a bit tricky with 3D is adding shadows. Shadows can be very expensive for the processor. So adding shadows requires a lot of different things that 3D uses to kind of like make sure everything is working right. So you don't have to add shadows, but I figure people will want to. So I'm just going to go over how to do that real quick. There are a few steps, and not all of our lights actually even cast shadows. Our directional light cast shadows and our point lights cast shadows. So a good way to look at how to add shadow is to go back to the documentation, go over to the directional light. Here it says this light can cast shadows. See the directional light shadow page, for example. And the thing that's nice about this is it actually tells us everything we need to do with our renderer as well as the light to make sure that the shadow will work, as well as our objects. So there's actually a few things we have to do here to make these shadows work. And we can add shadows to the editor real quick just so you can see what this will look like. So let's move these guys up a bit. And so to have a shadow, you actually have to have a surface for the shadow to be cast on. So I'm gonna add a plane, and I'm just gonna rotate the plane over a bit to create a floor. That's good enough. And then I'm gonna size it up a lot. So let's do that. So we need something to cast the shadows on. So let's go to our plane. We want it to receive shadows. Then we can go to the material. I'm gonna make it dark like our street. Whoops. Okay, and I'm gonna make it a little bit metal so it's not quite as reflective. And so we need there to be a difference between, you know, the color of the ground and the shadows that are being cast in order to actually see the shadows. So we do need a little bit of color there. So we have set that to receive shadows, and then we actually have to set our objects to cast shadows. So if I click cast here, and finally we need to get our light. So let's start with the directional light and say cast shadow. So now we can see the shadows being cast by these objects. And I already set this one up earlier. So then if we click on here and cast shadow, and so objects can both receive and cast shadows. If this guy was kind of like overlapping with the bench, then we need the bench, which I already set to receive shadows as well. You'll see if this guy is overlapping with our sphere, there's not going to be a shadow unless I go over here and say receive shadows. So you do have to say both. The processor really, shadows take a long time, so it doesn't really want to do all of that work. So it's going to avoid it if it can. One of the things we can also set with the shadows based on the light, so let's grab this light again, is the shadow radius. So if I decrease that, the shadow edge is going to be blockier. And if I increase it, it's going to be a little blurrier. So that's a little bit more true to real life. It's going to require a little bit more work, but that is a bit more how it's actually going to look. And there's a bunch of other stuff that we can do in here. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that just because it gets pretty complicated. But we can also cast shadows from our point lights. And so now we'll see a bunch of different shadows from each one of these objects, which is again kind of how things work in the real life, because every object receives and casts shadows in reality. And so if you have a lot of different light sources, you're going to get a lot of different types of shadows. So yeah, so let's add that into our scene. It's a bit complicated, but it looks cool. So if you want to do that, we are going to start with the renderer. So we first have to tell our renderer that we want to enable the shadow map. This is the thing that's going to calculate the shadows. Then we have to set the type of shadows. There's a few different options here. I'm just going to go with what they suggest, the PCF soft shadow map. So we have to add that in first. Let's just put a comment here, add shadows. And actually it doesn't really matter. I think I can do this after here. So I'll leave that there so you can take it out if you don't need them, because it will make your performance a bit worse. So finally, we want our light to cast a shadow. So this is our directional light. So we'll say directional light dot cast shadow equals true. And then we have to set up our shadow map size. So this is basically the area where it's gonna calculate where to add the shadows. So if you can basically save the processor some time by making this area smaller or larger depending on the size of your scene. I'm gonna stick with the defaults. And so then let's add some, now we have to tell our objects to cast or receive shadows. So our street is not gonna cast any shadows because it's on the ground. So let's just say receive shadows. And receive is hard to spell, so I'm gonna copy this and paste it. So receive shadow for the street equals true. These are both false by default, so if you don't wanna set them to true, just leave them alone. For our sidewalk, we can do the same thing because I don't really care if the sidewalk casts a shadow since it's on the ground. So I'll say sidewalk1 dot receive shadow is true. Sidewalk2 dot receive shadow is true. So then we have some things that we're gonna want to cast shadows. So now I have these point lights. If I want my point lights to cast a shadow, I can say light.cast shadow equals true. And then I need the same kind of thing here. Paste that here. So our point lights and our directional light, I just realized that I didn't change this variable. So let's do that real quick. Okay, so then we have our point light, cast shadow is true, set up the map size. Our lamp base, we can say equal dot cast shadow equals true. It's like black, so we don't really need to receive shadows. Lamp, we'll do the same thing. Lamp dot cast shadow equals true. The buildings, we can cast and receive shadows, so we'll say building dot cast shadow equals true, and building dot receive shadow equals true. Trees, we can do the same. So for our trunk, we'll say trunk dot cast equals true, trunk dot receive. So this is actually a lot of shadow stuff. So hopefully the performance won't go down too bad, but we can always remove it if we need to. So our leaf is the last thing. So let's take a look at how that looks. So yeah, there's a lot more realism added there. I wouldn't say the shadows are perfect. It's definitely better if you're like doing a rendering in like a 3D modeling program like Blender or something like that. The shadows here are not that great, but let's add a little bit of softness. I actually don't know how to set a shadow radius. Let's take a look. So let's say directional light. So I want to change the shadow radius so it's not quite as sharp. Let's see if I can do that. So shadow radius is 1. Okay, so to do that, I have to go to directional light dot shadow dot radius, and let's just set it to 5. See what that looks like. Okay, those shadows look a little bit more natural, and the processing doesn't seem to be hurting at all. So that's pretty good. So yeah, that's kind of adding some lighting, some materials to our scene. That looks pretty good. And so obviously without getting into too much more complexity, if we want to add, there's another aspect to creating materials, which is the texture. Textures are basically like images that get patterned over. I don't want to spend a ton of time here because it is just like a whole other topic that you can really get weighed down in. One thing that can be nice, you can get textures for free online. If I type in like noise texture, you're going to see some examples. I can go to tools and say Creative Commons and just grab like a noise texture. So something like this is pretty nice for just like a basic texture. And this is from Wikimedia Commons, so that's good. I can save this. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to go to my project, and I'm going to create a new folder for this. So I'll just call this textures. And I'm just going to call this noise.png. So if I want to add a texture to my material, I'm going to need to load that texture like an image in P5. So I need a texture loader, and then to add it to the material, I use the property map. So let's grab this loader first, and I'm just going to add this texture to my sidewalk because I think it'll add some nice detail. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to say noise texture equals new Three.js texture loader, and then I'm going to replace this with noise.png. This I'm not too worried about because it shouldn't take too long for this to happen. There is a way to load it with a callback if you have like very large textures, which a lot of like heavy 3D scenes have. This one is 780 kilobytes, which is actually pretty big, so that might not be that great, but we'll see how it goes. So I have the noise texture. I'm going to go to the sidewalk, and when I create my material, after the color, I'm just going to add a map property and then the noise texture. So then when I go back to my scene, so yeah, it does increase the loading time quite a bit, but look at that noise texture. It looks very nice, and it interacts with the lighting, and it really makes our sidewalk look a lot more realistic. It looks a little bit distorted on the insides, which is something you can fix with a little bit more work. That looks pretty decent just for adding it, kind of right off the bat. So there are a lot of different types of 3D textures. If we search 3D textures and go to images, you can see all sorts of different things that might apply to your scene, depending on what your objects are or what the look you're going for is. And you can also make sure that these are Creative Commons, so that you can make sure that you're using materials that are, allowed to be used. So there's things like fabric, things like, this looks like maybe some cement, different types of materials. So you can apply this as like a wood material. You can apply these in different ways to change the overall look of the object without adding a lot more geometry or other things like that. So I think that's pretty good for our scene. There's a lot more that goes into a lot of these different topics, but I think this is a good overview for now. So I'm gonna go ahead and commit this new version. So let's make a screenshot real quick. I'm just gonna close some of these extra windows. All right, so let's just make a screenshot of this. So I'm gonna rotate around so we see those highlights a bit more, and just take a screenshot of the whole thing. And so then let's go ahead and open up index.html. Gonna copy this project. So this is now project 3-2. And so let's call this 3.js lighting and materials. And so now I just have to add the thumbnail. So I'm going to delete the old thumbnail and get to the downloads folder. Or wait, this is on the desktop. So this is thumbnail.png. Let's throw that in there. And so let's go back. Whoops, I closed this. Let's go back to the home page and just make sure that looks all right. Okay, so there's our first scene. Here's our scene with lighting, so we can kind of see the differences there. So that's pretty good. Let's go over to GitHub and just adds new scene with lighting and materials and commit to master. And so that's it for this video. Let me know if you have any questions on email or Discord, or you can ask me in class, and I'll see you guys in class.